Richard Price sat behind his massive dark mahogany desk, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his sleek glass-walled office. The sprawling city of New York lay beneath him, a testament to his power and success. At 65, Richard had achieved everything he'd ever wanted, or so it seemed to the outside world. His empire, a tech giant that spanned continents, was a symbol of his relentless ambition. But as he sat there, his sharp blue eyes scanning the distant horizon, there was a hollowness within him that even his success couldn't fill. His once jet-black hair had turned silver at the edges, and the lines on his face told a story of years of control, focus, and discipline. Richard was still an imposing figure, his presence commanding attention in any room. Yet behind the cold facade, there lingered an old wound, a scar that had never fully healed. On the corner of his desk sat a single Ferrari. The picture was slightly faded, the edges worn from time, but the woman in it remained as vivid in his memory as the day the photo was taken. Megan. The name alone stirred feelings Richard had buried deep within himself for decades. She had been the one. His great love. The woman who had walked out of his life without a word. He had spent years wondering why, tormenting himself with unanswered questions. She was the only person who had ever made him feel something real, something more than just the drive for success. But she had left, and Richard had thrown himself into his work, building his company from the ground up, trying to forget the pain she caused him. Yet no matter how many deals he closed or how much money he made, that one memory, of her smile, of her laughter, refused to fade. And now, years later, all he had left of her was that photo. The soft chime of the intercom broke the silence. "Price, Ethan Scott is here with the quarterly report." His assistant's voice echoed through the speaker. Richard blinked, snapping back to the present. He straightened in his chair, pulling himself out of the past and back into the role he knew so well, the powerful, unshakable CEO. "Send him in," Richard replied, his tone firm and professional. The door to his office opened, and Ethan Scott stepped inside, carrying a sleek black folder. Richard regarded the young man with a faint nod of approval. At 25, Ethan was a rising star in the company. Sharp, ambitious, and hard-working, he reminded Richard of himself at that age, determined to prove himself, willing to sacrifice everything to succeed. But there was something about Ethan that Richard couldn't quite place, something familiar. His sharp features, the intensity in his eyes, the way he carried himself, it all felt oddly known. Richard shook off the thought. He had met countless young professionals over the years, each eager to climb the corporate ladder. Ethan was no different, or so he told himself. "Good afternoon, Mr. Price," Ethan said, his voice steady and respectful as he approached the desk. "Afternoon, Ethan. Let's see what you've got," Richard replied, gesturing for him to sit as he reached for the folder. Ethan placed the report in front of Richard, but as he sat, his eyes wandered for just a moment. It wasn't the grand office or the panoramic view that caught his attention. It was the photograph on the corner of the desk. For a moment, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, staring at the picture. It was a black and white photo of a woman, young and beautiful, with a warm smile that seemed both familiar and distant. Her dark hair framed her face perfectly, and her eyes. There was something about them that made Ethan's heart race. He knew those eyes. He had seen them before. The room seemed to close in around him as realization struck. The woman in the photograph, it was his mother. He almost didn't hear Richard as he flipped through the report, nodding in approval. Ethan's mind was spinning. How could this be? Why did Richard Price have a picture of his mother on his desk? His mother had never mentioned Richard. She had never talked much about her past at all, least of all about any man she might have been involved with before Ethan was born. His throat went dry and he forced himself to look away from the photograph, trying to regain his composure. But the questions swirled in his mind like a storm. What was the connection? Why did Richard have that photo? Richard's voice broke through his thoughts. "The projections look solid," he said, glancing up at Ethan. "We'll move forward with these adjustments." Yes, sir," Ethan replied, his voice shaky. He tried to focus, but his mind kept drifting back to that picture. Richard noticed the slight tremor in Ethan's voice and the way his eyes kept darting toward the photograph. With a slight frown, he shifted the frame, moving it further out of Ethan's line of sight. It was a small, subtle gesture, but it was enough to make Ethan's pulse quicken. Richard was protective of that photo, too protective. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then finally gathered the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his mind since he saw the picture. "Mr. Price," he began cautiously, "I couldn't help but notice the photo on your desk. The woman in it, she looks a lot like my mother." Richard's entire demeanor changed in an instant. His body stiffened and his eyes narrowed, the icy blue of his gaze locking onto Ethan with a sudden intensity. For a moment, the room felt colder, the air heavier. "She was someone I knew a long time ago," Richard said, his voice clipped and distant. It was clear he didn't want to say more, but the tension in the room. There was something in Richard's expression, something almost pained. Ethan nodded, feeling as though he had crossed an invisible line. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry," he said quickly, standing up from his chair. Richard said nothing, merely nodding in return as Ethan turned and left the office. But as the door closed behind him, Ethan's mind was spinning. That was no coincidence. His mother had to have known Richard Price. That photo, the way Richard reacted, it was all too strange to ignore. As he rode the elevator down to his floor, Ethan's thoughts raced. Could Richard Price be the man his mother had always refused to talk about? Could he be his father? It seemed impossible, yet the more Ethan thought about it, the more it made sense. His mother had always been secretive about her past, particularly about the man she had loved before Ethan was born. And Richard, with all his power and wealth, fit the vague picture she had painted of a man who was distant, unreachable. When Ethan arrived home that evening, he couldn't get the thought out of his head. He paced his small apartment, running the conversation over and over in his mind. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, he picked up his phone and dialed his mother's number. Megan answered after a few rings, her voice warm and familiar. "Ethan, sweetheart, how are you?" "I'm fine, Mom," Ethan said, his voice tense. "I need to ask you something." "What is it, honey?" Megan asked, her tone light, but there was a subtle edge of concern in her voice. "I was at work today in Mr. Price's office and I saw a photograph, a picture of a woman. She looked exactly like you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Too long. "Megan?" Ethan pressed. What did you just say?" Megan's voice was quiet, almost fearful. "I saw a picture of a woman, and it looked like you," Ethan repeated, his heart pounding. "What's going on, Mom? Who is R? Did you know him?" I can't talk about this," Megan stammered, her voice shaking. "Ethan, please, just let it go." "Let it go?" Ethan felt frustration rising in his chest. "Mom, why won't you tell me the truth? What aren't you telling me?" "I have to go," Megan whispered, and then the line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone in disbelief. His mother's reaction had said everything. There was something there, something big, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out what it was. Ethan couldn't shake the conversation with his mother. The way she had cut him off, the fear in her voice. It was clear there was more to the story than she was willing to share. And Richard Price's reaction to his question about the photograph only confirmed it further. Ethan felt a strange pull toward the man, a connection he couldn't fully explain. But one thing was certain: he needed answers. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself in Richard's office more often than before. His work had always been solid, but now he was pushing himself harder, staying late, taking on additional projects that would require him to interact with Richard directly. He needed to be around Richard, to observe him, to see if there were any clues in his behavior that could reveal the truth. To Ethan's surprise, Richard seemed to warm to him. The CEO, who was known for being aloof and distant, had begun to trust him with more responsibilities, even asking for his opinion on certain matters, something Ethan knew was rare. It was almost as if Richard saw something in him, something familiar, Ethan caught the older man staring at him more than once during their meetings, his gaze lingering just a little too long. At first, Ethan thought he was imagining it, but as time went on, he realized that Richard was studying him, as if searching for. One afternoon, as they sat together in Richard's office reviewing a project proposal, Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Ethan. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Richard said, almost absently. He didn't elaborate, and Ethan didn't press him, though his heart began to race. Was Richard thinking about Megan? Was he starting to make the connection? Or was Ethan simply projecting his own suspicions onto the situation? The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable, until Richard cleared his throat and returned to the documents in front of him. "Good work on this," he said, his tone once again businesslike. "We'll move forward with the recommendations." "Thank you, Mr. Price," Ethan replied, rising from his chair. As he turned to leave, he hesitated, feeling the weight of the unsaid words between them. Finally, he mustered the courage to ask a question that had been on his mind since their last "Price, do you ever think about the past?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone casual, though his nerves were on edge. Richard's hand froze for a split second as he closed the folder, and he looked up at Ethan with a curious expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people from your past. Old friends, relationships," Ethan clarified, his heart pounding in his chest. Richard's face darkened slightly, and for a moment, Ethan thought he had pushed too far. But then Richard sighed and leaned back in his chair again, staring out the window at the city below. "I suppose we all think about the past from time to time," Richard said quietly, "but the past has a way of staying where it belongs, in the rearview mirror." Ethan nodded, feeling a mix of disappointment and curiosity. Richard's words were carefully chosen, but there was something behind them, something unsaid. He knew now more than ever that his suspicions were right. There was a connection between Richard and his mother, and he was determined to uncover it. Over the next few days, Richard's behavior grew more peculiar. He continued to work closely with Ethan, but there was a tension in the air, a subtle unease that Ethan couldn't ignore. Richard's gaze lingered on him more often, and there were moments when it seemed like Richard wanted to say something but stopped himself. One evening, as Ethan was preparing to leave the office, he saw Richard standing by the window, looking out at the skyline. The room was dimly lit, and the shadows played across Richard's face, making him look older, more vulnerable than usual. Ethan watched him for a moment, unsure whether to approach or leave him alone. But something in Richard's posture, the way his shoulders were slightly slumped, made Ethan feel that this was the right moment. "Mr. Price," Ethan said softly, stepping into Day. Richard turned, surprised to see him. "Ethan," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "I wanted to ask you something," Ethan began, his voice hesitant. "About that photo on your desk. You said she was someone you knew a long time ago. Is there more to it than that?" Richard's face tightened, and for a moment Ethan thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then Richard sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Why do you care, Ethan?" Richard asked, his voice low. "What's this real?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the truth hovering just out of reach, but he wasn't ready to reveal everything. "Not yet. I guess I'm just curious," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She looks a lot like someone I know." Richard stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Ethan's face as if looking for answers. Then, without a word, Richard turned back to the window, his reflection in the glass looking distant and haunted. "Some things are better left in the past," Richard said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night, Ethan." Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Finally, he nodded and left the room, his mind racing with more questions than ever. Meanwhile, Megan Scott was beginning to feel the weight of the secret she had kept for so long. After Ethan's phone call, she had barely been able to sleep. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of Richard and the life they had once shared. She had always known this day would come, but she had never imagined it would be this difficult. Sitting at her kitchen table, Megan stared at the phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She knew she should call Ethan, explain everything to him before he found out on his own. But every time she tried, the words stuck in her throat. How could she tell her son that the man he worked for was his father? That she had kept this from him his entire life? As the days passed, Megan's anxiety grew. Ethan was becoming more insistent with his questions, and Megan could feel the walls closing in around her. She had tried to distract herself with work, with her usual routines, but nothing could take her mind off the growing storm that was about to break. Ethan had always been a curious child, and now that he was an adult, he was relentless in his pursuit of the truth. Megan had hoped that he would drop the subject, that he would let the past stay buried where it belonged. But she knew her son. He wouldn't stop until he had answers. Late one evening, Megan's phone rang and her heart sank when she saw Ethan's name on the screen. She hesitated for a moment, then answered, bracing herself for the conversation she had been dreading. "Mom, we need to talk," Ethan said, his voice tense. Megan closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. "Ethan, why didn't you tell me?" Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. "Why didn't you ever tell me about Richard Price?" Megan's heart raced and she gripped the phone tighter. "Ethan, please, it's not that simple." "Not that simple?" Ethan's voice was filled with frustration. "I've been working for him, Mom. All this time, I've been working for him. And you never said a word. Why? Why did you keep this from me?" Tears welled in Megan's eyes as she struggled to find the words. "I didn't want to hurt you, Ethan," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Ethan's voice cracked. "Mom, I've spent my whole life wondering about my father, and now I find out like this? Through a photograph?" Megan's chest tightened, and she felt a sob rising in her throat. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted this to happen. I thought I was protecting you." Ethan was silent for a long moment, and Megan could hear the pain in his breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but filled with resolve. "I need to know the truth, Mom. All of it." Megan wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. "I promise I'll tell you everything, just not over the phone. Can we talk in person?" Ethan hesitated. "Fine. I'll come by tomorrow." As the call ended, Megan sat in the silence of her kitchen, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had kept hidden for so long. Tomorrow, she would have to face the past and the consequences of her choices. That when the truth finally came out, Ethan's hand trembled as he placed the photograph on Richard's desk. The room was filled with a heavy silence, as Richard's gaze moved from Ethan's face to the picture in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Richard's face, usually so composed and controlled, betrayed nothing, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, something unreadable, something far beneath. "She's my mother," Ethan said, his voice low and firm, breaking the silence. "Megan Scott, the woman in the picture, she's my mother." Richard blinked, his brow furrowing slightly as he processed the words. He picked up the photograph, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. His fingers brushed the edges of the frame as if it held a memory he had long buried. Then slowly, he set the photo down again and looked up at Ethan, confusion clouding his eyes. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "What does this have to do with you?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him, suffocating him. This was it. There was no turning back now. "You're my father," Ethan said, the words hanging in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. "You never knew, but I'm your son." Richard's face went pale, his eyes widening in shock. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The powerful, unshakable CEO who had built an empire from nothing was suddenly just a man, vulnerable and exposed. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. "That's not possible," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "Megan, she would have told me. She tried, Ethan replied, his voice filled with emotion. She tried to tell you, but you were too busy. You had already started building the company, and she couldn't reach you. So she left. Shiro. Richard's eyes darted back to the photograph as if searching for some clue, something that would explain how he had missed this, how he had gone 25 years without knowing he had a son. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as the enormity of what Ethan was saying began to sink in. I didn't know, Richard said, his voice cracking. I never knew. If I had known. Ethan stepped closer, his anger rising to the surface. But you didn't, did you? You were too focused on your career, too busy building your empire to notice. She didn't think you were ready to be a father, so she kept it from you. And now, here we are, 25 years later, and I'm just finding out that the man I've been working for is the father I never knew. Richard looked up at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Ethan, Don't. Ethan cut him off, his voice sharp. Don't apologize, it's too late for that. Richard's mouth closed, and for a moment the two men stood in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them both. Ethan's chest heaved with the intensity of his emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep sadness he hadn't expected to feel. Megan never wanted me to grow up feeling unwanted, Ethan continued, his voice shaking. She thought she was doing the right thing by keeping me away from you, by raising me on her own. But I had questions she could never answer, and now I have even more. Richard's face was ashen, his hands clenching and unclenching as if trying to grasp the reality of what he was hearing. I would have been there for you, he said, his voice hoarse. If I had known, I would have been there. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. Would you? Or would you have just thrown money at the problem and disappeared into your work again? Richard flinched at the accusation, but he didn't deny it. He knew deep down that there was some truth to Ethan. He had always been driven, always focused on building his company, even at the cost of personal relationships. And now, that obsession had cost him something far greater. I'm sorry, Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this without me. Ethan stared at him, his emotions churning. Part of him wanted to lash out, to scream at the man who had unknowingly abandoned him. But another part of him, one that he barely recognized, felt pity for Ari. He could see the pain in his father's eyes, the regret that came from a lifetime of missed opportunities. I don't know what you want from me, Ethan, Richard said, his voice raw. I can't change the past, but if you'll let me, I want to make it right. Ethan's heart twisted at the words. For a moment he considered it, considered giving Richard a chance. But the anger, the betrayal, it was all too fresh, too overwhelming. I need time, Ethan said, his voice cold. I need time to figure out Wani. Don't expect anything from me, Richard. I'm not ready for that. Richard nodded, his face filled with sorrow. Take all the time you need. Without another word, Ethan turned and walked out of the office, leaving Richard behind, devastated and alone. The world outside Richard's office seemed surreal to Ethan as he stepped into the hallway, his legs shaky beneath him. He had said what he needed to say, but instead of feeling relief, all he felt was an overwhelming sense of emptiness. He had finally confronted his father, and yet it had left him feeling more adrift than ever. As he walked away from the office, his mind replayed the confrontation over and over. Richard's face, the shock in his eyes, the way his voice had broken when he realized the truth. It all felt too real, too raw. Ethan had never imagined what it would be like to meet his father, let alone to confront him with 25 years of pain and confusion. Now that it had happened, he wasn't sure how to process it. He wandered through the streets of New York, the cold wind biting at his skin as he tried to make sense of everything. How was he supposed to move forward now? What did this mean for his relationship with his mother, with Richard? There were no easy answers, and the weight of that uncertainty felt like a crushing burden. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city. Eventually, Ethan found himself standing outside his mother's house once again. He hadn't planned to come back so soon, but something had drawn him there, some unspoken need for closure, for more answers. He knocked on the door and Megan opened it almost immediately, her face pale and strained. She had been waiting for him. "Ethan," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. He entered the house, the warmth of the familiar space doing little to ease the chill in his heart. They sat at the kitchen table just as they had the night before, but this time the air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I told him," Ethan said quietly, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Megan inhaled sharply, her eyes wide with concern. How did he react? Ethan shook his head, his voice tight with emotion. He was shocked. He didn't know. He had no idea. Megan looked down, tears welling in her eyes. "I always knew this day would come," she whispered, "but I wasn't prepared for how hard it would be." "Why didn't you tell him?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Why didn't you ever try to reach out again?" Megan wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. "I was scared, Ethan. I didn't know if he would want us. He was so focused on his work, on building his company, that I didn't think there would be room for a family. I didn't want you to grow up with a father who wasn't there." Ethan's chest tightened as he listened to his mother's words. "But I didn't have a father at all. I grew up not knowing who I was because of that decision. I thought I was protecting you," Megan said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want you to feel like you were a burden to him. I didn't want you to be hurt by his absence." Ethan stared at his mother, his emotions swirling in a confusing mix of anger and understanding. He could see the regret in her eyes, the pain that had haunted her for years. And for the first time, he realized that she had been just, "I don't know how to feel about any of this," Ethan admitted, his voice soft. "I'm angry, I'm confused, I don't know what to do." Megan reached across the table, her hand trembling as she took his. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she whispered. "I wish I could take it all back. I wish I had made different choices, but all I can do now is hope that you and Richard can find some way to move forward." Ethan looked down at their hands, his heart heavy with the weight of the past. He wasn't sure if he could forgive his mother for keeping the truth from him, but he knew that she had acted out of fear, not malice. And in that moment, he realized that they were both victims of a situation that had spiraled out of control. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you," Ethan said quietly, "but I'm willing to try." Megan's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her grip tightening around his hand. "That's all I can ask for." With Megan and Richard both weighing on his heart, Ethan left his mother's house that night with a sense of uncertainty, but also a faint glimmer of hope. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal the wounds of the past. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and silence. Ethan had left Richard's office without looking back, but the weight of the confrontation hung over him. He had never imagined meeting his father under such circumstances, and now that he had, the anger and confusion seemed to follow him like a shadow. He hadn't returned Richard's messages or calls, not because he didn't care, but because he simply didn't know how to respond. How do you build a bridge between two people separated by 25 years of unspoken truths? For Richard, the revelation had been like a sledgehammer to the carefully constructed walls he had built around his life. He had spent so long distancing himself from emotion, focusing on his company, his legacy, that he hadn't left room for anything else. And now, in the space of a few hours, the one thing he had unknowingly missed out on, a family, had come crashing back into his life. He tried reaching out to Ethan, sending texts, emails, even calling a few times, but each time he was met with silence. It was unbearable. Richard was used to taking charge, solving problems, but this, his relationship with his son, was something he couldn't control. As the days turned into a week, Richard found himself sitting in his office long after everyone else had left, staring at the photograph of Megan that Ethan had brought back. It wasn't just Ethan who had reappeared in his life. It was Megan too. And with her return came all the unresolved emotions he had buried for so long. Finally, one evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, Richard dialed a number he hadn't called in years. His heart raced as the line rang, and when Megan's familiar voice answered, a flood of memories surged back. "Richard," she said, her tone cautious. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." Richard took a deep breath, his voice steady but strained. "I think it's time we talked. About everything." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Megan finally spoke again. They sat together in the living room, a small table separating them, the tension palpable. Richard was the first to speak. "I never knew," he said, his voice low. "I never knew about Ethan." Megan nodded, her hands resting in her lap. "I know. I tried to tell you, but every time I called, I was met with the same answer. Richard's busy. Richard's in a meeting. Richard's traveling. After a while, I stopped trying. I didn't want to force myself into a life you weren't ready for." Richard looked down, shame washing over him. "I would have been there, Megan. If I had known, I would have been there for both of you." Megan's gaze softened. "Maybe you would have, but I didn't believe that at the time. You were so focused on your career, on your vision for the company. I knew I couldn't compete with that. And I didn't want Ethan to grow up feeling like he wasn't enough. I thought I was doing what was best for him." Richard sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. I don't know how, but I want to try." Megan looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Richard, we've both changed. The people we were back then, they don't exist anymore. I don't regret leaving, but that doesn't mean I didn't love you. I did, and part of me still does. But you have to understand, the man you are now isn't the man I left behind." Richard's chest tightened. Hearing her say that she still had feelings for him stirred something inside him, but her words also made him realize how much time had passed, how much had changed. He wasn't the same person, and neither was she. "I never stopped loving you," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I buried it. I buried it so deep that I convinced myself it didn't matter. I was wrong." Megan's eyes glistened with tears, but she held them back. "I loved you too, Richard. But I couldn't stay. I had to think of Ethan, and I didn't think you could give him the life he needed." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their shared history hanging between them like a heavy curtain. Finally, Megan spoke again, her voice quiet but resolute. "What matters now is Ethan," she said. "We've hurt him by keeping all of this from him for so long. He needs time, and we need to give that to him. But maybe, just maybe, there's a chance to heal from all of this." Richard nodded, a sense of acceptance settling over him. "I just want to be a part of his life, Megan. I want a chance to be the father I never got to be." Megan smiled, a sad but hopeful smile. "He'll come around. Just give him time." Ethan stood by the window of his apartment staring out at the city skyline, his mind racing with thoughts of everything that had happened over the past week. It felt surreal, as though he had stepped into someone else's life. The man who had always been a distant figure of success and power was his father. It was still hard to wrap his mind around it. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. It was another message from Richard, another attempt to reach out. Ethan hadn't replied to any of them, not because he didn't care, but because he needed time to process everything. He wasn't ready to talk to Richard yet, but he also knew he couldn't ignore him forever. With a deep breath, Ethan picked up the phone and stared at Richard. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I won't rush you. I just want you to know that I'm here whenever you're ready. I want to be part of your life, Ethan. I want to make up for lost time." Ethan's heart ached as he read the words. He could feel the sincerity in Richard's message, the longing to fix what had been broken for so long. But the pain of being kept in the dark for all those years still weighed heavily on him. He sat down on the couch, staring at the phone in his hands. He had always wondered what his father was like, but now that he knew, the reality was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Richard wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man filled with regrets, with a past that had shaped him into the person he had become. And now, for the first time in his life, Ethan had the opportunity to get to know that man. But was he ready? Ethan closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to the conversation with his mother. She had told him about the man Richard used to be. The man who had loved her, but who had also been consumed by his ambition. She had made her choices out of fear, out of a desire to protect him. But Ethan couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if she had told him the truth from the beginning. But the past was the past. And now, Ethan had a choice to make. He could keep holding on to the anger and betrayal, or he could take a step forward, toward the possibility of something. With a sigh, Ethan typed out a response. "Ethan, I need more time, but I'm not closing the door. Let's talk soon." He hit send and immediately felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. A few days later, Ethan met with Richard at a small cafe near his apartment. It was a quiet place, far from the towering office buildings where they usually met. Richard looked different outside of his corporate environment, less imposing, more human. They talked about neutral things at first, work, the weather, even a bit of sports. But eventually the conversation turned to the past. "I want you to know," Richard said, his voice soft but steady, "that I regret every moment I missed with you. I didn't know, but that doesn't change the fact that I wasn't there. I want to make up for it if you'll let me." Ethan studied his father's face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this yet," Ethan admitted, "but I'm willing to give it a shot. We can't change the past, but maybe we can build something now." Richard nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's all I can ask for." As they left the cafe, Ethan felt a sense of cautious hope. The path ahead wasn't clear, and there would be challenges, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was beginning to understand who he was and where he came from. Back at her house, Megan sat by the window, watching the world outsee. She thought of Richard, of Ethan, and of all the years in between. She didn't know what the future held for them, but she knew that there was a chance, however small, that they could find peace with one another, and maybe, just maybe, they could find peace with themselves too. I hope you enjoyed this emotional journey. If you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Please leave a comment below and share your reactions. Your feedback means the world to me, and I can't wait to hear what you think.